Welcome to Mike Drop. I'm David Kamens. The news game, the TV news game. We've got a superstar for you today to break it down. This gentleman works in a very respected marketplace at the number one station. He is the news director, and I can't wait for you to hear from him. I have questions about how he hires, who he hires. I have questions about maybe North Carolina football, and how about we understand where news is today and how it's changing and how that maybe increases the challenges around his job. Come on along on Mike Drop. So pleased to be joined by Mike Friedrich. Mike, you are a news director at WRAL. I don't need to tell you that, but thanks so much for being on Mike Drop. And one of the things I want to go over because everybody has a pathway to where they are, but I think the job of news director is a vast one, and you have to gather a lot of say knowledge along the way of not only of news but how to operate a newsroom. What was your pathway to get to where you are today, and maybe where did it all begin?
Yeah, David, thank you so much for having me. And, I ended up getting into this business. I was one of those guys who, when I was 6 or 7 years old, who was watching the news back in Pittsburgh, where I grew up. Part of me wanted to be either Dick Enberg or Pat Summerall calling the 425 NFL game. And I had two paths that I was looking into, news and sports. And, you saw the value of how you could really impact your community with news, which is why I really chose that path. But and at the moment in time, whenever I got into the business in the late 1990s, I took the path that a lot of people took at the time, where I wanted to be on air, and I was on air at a government access station for a little over a year, but discovered along the way that I was better suited for producing and being behind the camera, which ultimately led to a management path. I started my career at CNN News Source in Atlanta with an entry level job there, which led me to that reporting job in between Baltimore and Washington. And then I took the path of going behind the scenes, where I started um, at WJZ in Baltimore to CBS O&O, where I went from associate producer to executive producer, then took a management job at WJLA in Washington. And that led to an assistant news director job at the NBC station in Houston. And then I took a 3.5 year break from local news. I still did a number of freelance jobs for some national outlets and media influencers, but I took a period of time where I was at the Public Information Office during the 2020 census at the Census Bureau, and also started my social media business, where I focused on real estate entities and doing their social media to promote their own businesses. But then I got a call from a former news director who hired me and alerted me about a news director job in Salt Lake City. And I always had that fire still in the belly. And that is what led me to go to KUTV, where I was news director there for 2.5 years. And really proud to say our team worked together to lead us to being the most watched news station in Salt Lake City whenever we were there, especially the last year and a half I was there. And in addition to that, we really grew our YouTube channel. When stations were struggling and saw erosions in digital traffic, we were able to get our digital traffic up, especially when people were going back to work. So we had a lot of successes there. And then this wonderful opportunity popped up. News director jobs at WRAL don't grow on trees, and the opportunity presented itself. And Joel Davis, who was our general manager at the time, made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And now I've been here for a year and a half, and it's been a wonderful experience working with our current general manager, Heather Gray, and our entire team here.
Well, kudos to you for climbing the great ladder. I mean, and I know you respect, as I do, those that went that way. Not that there's anything wrong with being an influencer and getting 30,000 follows, and next thing people are sending you checks. But if there's something to it, isn't there, to have a dream, and Dick Enberg's a darn good one,
Yeah.
to then understanding who you are, and then finding the pathway to producing and eventually news directing by honing those skills. That's to be really congratulated, and good job getting to know yourself, right? Isn't that part of it? Don't you
It really
find?
is. And so much of what you have to learn is what are your strengths, play to those strengths, and you're allowed to change your mind. You may think that you want to do one thing, but we're all human and we may want to do something for a period of time, but not forever. And this led to me ultimately deciding going down the producing path was the best path for me, which ultimately led to management positions and in the gift of being able to move across the country and meet different types of people and experience a lot of different things that I wouldn't have experienced otherwise, which led me to this point.
So now you're in a hiring position. And I just want to start here because so many people that come through our world at Can Broadcast Talent Coaching want to know how to either change their career or bolster their career or re-energize their career. And if you're in a hiring position at the number one in a pretty nice size market, you are discerning, aren't you? Who makes it through your door? Who doesn't? Maybe just as importantly, right? What are those factors, and what does it look like for you day to day?
For me, it really is about the total package. And the total package is someone who has strong journalistic integrity and bones and good storytelling, with someone who understands where we are in this period of time in our industry, just in the sense of understanding that we live in unique times, and that as a broadcaster, no matter the platform, understanding that we're reporting for a lot of different people and maybe people who we struggle to understand, who we may not agree with, but ultimately everybody deserves a voice,
Hmm,
and making sure that we're serving our community and our people, somebody who's community centric, and then also somebody who does understand multiple platforms in the sense of the value of being on social media, the value of making sure that that they consider digital platforms almost as a first screen as opposed to TV being a second or a third screen at this point. And just thinking in terms of how do people live their lives day to day, and how do we as journalists and how do we as part of WRAL News make sure that we're there for them from the first push alert that we send first thing in the morning to the last push alert at night, and making sure that we operate truly as a 24/7 news organization. And somebody, whenever we're looking in the hiring process, somebody who really embraces that. Um, and also understanding who they, the responsibility of whether you're on air or off the air, that you do represent a media organization and a news organization, whether you're on the clock or not, and understanding that there's a value to what you put out on your own private social media. Somewhat folks who don't understand that are folks who are not going to work here, and
hmm.
folks who do understand that have a far greater chance of working here. That we're all our own brand, and but at the same time we're all journalists, and understanding that that delicate balance, and understanding the value of all platforms in 2025 and beyond. Those are the
Hmm.
people who have a higher likelihood of joining our team.
Wow. I mean, really broad answer, but there's so much to be culled from what you just said. I felt like tips as to how to conduct an interview, meaning how to be in an interview and get ahead. Because if I'm able to check all the boxes that you just mentioned, I have a way better shot of being on your team. That was great. So I remember when I was executive producer of a regional sports network in the Northwest, my toughest hire was the chief engineer, right? Finding that guy that could communicate to humans and be technically super proficient. What's your toughest hire and why?
That's a great question. We ended up hiring a new news operations manager at the beginning of this year, and that is not my strength. So I think it's a matter of understanding someone who you communicate with, who understands the basics of what you're trying to do as a team, no different than any other team member. But then you need to hire somebody strong enough that, as the department head, that you can delegate that to, and they're going to take care of you and they have your back. And we're really fortunate that we made a really great hire in that role, but it was something where I had to have great attention to detail to things in a different way because it was out of my comfort zone. Where I've hired anchors in the past, I've hired reporters in the past, I've hired producers in the past. When you're hiring like a news operations manager, and this was the second time I had done it in my career, it's one of those where you need to really be focused on what the needs of the team are, what the needs of the organization are, and especially when you're hiring something that is where it's not your area of expertise, you need to it's really you never want to miss on anything, but you really can't miss on that. And understanding that you need someone who is going to be a great teammate and a great right hand to you.
Let's do some rapid fire on those that are in your wheelhouse. What makes a great producer, news producer? And what's something maybe outside of the norm that you want to point out about that person?
I would say great flexibility, great writing, and great news judgment. Those are the
Okay.
three for me.
Host, an on-air host, someone that, maybe was a reporter or maybe wasn't. Do you feel like your desk people need to have been in the field at one point?
They do. And I would say they need to be in the field now as well. Like
Hmm.
any anchor that we hire, or any host that we hire, needs to have a level of significance. And that needs to be more than reading anchor tosses and VOs. The viewer really values someone who's hosting a program who can go out there. They're supposed to be the best reporters or among them. And we're very fortunate to have very active anchors who really are part of the, or who are also reporters. Anchors and hosts also need to be reporters and also need to be copy editors. They have to be very active in the product in order to be successful.
So then younger reporters, what do you want to see out of them? What's something again that stands out that may not be obvious to you?
Um, Writing is always going to be a big one for me, and someone who can tell a story, but also someone who's going to have the urgency of understanding of making something fresh and relevant, and then someone who understands where we live in this world of multi-platforms, that in a different period of time, the be all end all was putting stories and content together for the newscast, and now the newscasts are just another speed bump along the way of a 24/7 cycle. So there are times when news doesn't just break during a newscast, it breaks 24/7. So we need to be having reporters who understand that this is something we got to get on our website, this is something we have to get on our app, this is something we have to get on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, whatever that may be. That basically when news happens, that WRAL is there no matter what platform a person's using. I mean, even from a research perspective, we even know this year that social media has eclipsed TV as the number one place where people are consuming their news and content. So we have to be in those spaces in order to be relevant for the entire audience, not just a younger audience, but audiences, whether you're 9 or 90, that we're there for you.
Let's get into sports real
Yeah.
quick. How's your sports hire? I know Raleigh is an active market, doesn't have a major league team, however. So talk to me about the local, regional, and national play and what you like to see in a sports person.
I would say somebody who can do more than just give me the scores and highlights. When I look at a sports anchor or a sports reporter, it's no different than a news anchor or news reporter or an investigative journalist or consumer journalist. They really need to be community centric. They need to build sources and relationships. And that is actually how we were very fortunate, last month to be able to break some significant news within the Belichick run UNC football program as far as a divided locker room. Is our Pat Welter, who is our sports executive producer, and he's an anchor. But more than anything else, both of our sports anchors are reporters first. And it's really building those relationships, because I think journalism is a relationships business. It's how you find things out, is that people have a trust in you to be able to report properly, and what is going on and with accuracy. Trust is everything, I think, in our business, and sports is, I think, no different, if not especially important in order to build sources and to actually break news.
Who would have thought that Belichick thing wouldn't go well? Huh. Uh,
You know,
well,
it could go either way. I mean that's the thing is that this is a man, you know, who I would say, for as many accolades as he's had with 6 Super Bowls, the man was a defensive coordinator for the Giants,
no
and
doubt.
and was one of the was behind one of the biggest upsets in Super Bowl history in Super Bowl 25 when the Giants upset the Bills. Another thing people forget is that they sort of tarnish his record in Cleveland. The next to last year, where he was the head coach, he was 11-5 and made the playoffs and won a playoff game. And Cleveland was the hot pick to be in the Super Bowl in 1995. And what people forget about Bill Belichick is that it wasn't really Bill Belichick that sabotaged Bill Belichick in Cleveland. It was Art Modell, because they had a winning record before Art Modell announced he was moving the team to Baltimore, and that just set up a position where Bill Belichick could not succeed. So he ended up, reteaming with his old friend Bill Parcells, ends up ultimately in New England, and the rest is history. But then you look at, he has the most accomplished resume you can even imagine. However, the last few years in New England didn't go as well. You put a defensive coordinator in charge of the offense. Bill Belichick, the general manager, maybe wasn't as strong as Bill Belichick, the head coach, and they didn't have the talent. And now he's also, yes, he has Mike Lombardi in charge, but Mike Lombardi, it's also talent evaluation, and you don't even have the runway with the players that you do with the NFL. So I think you can also make an argument college football is in some respects more difficult to be able to build a program than it is in the NFL, because you have no continuity whatsoever. You never know. He's an accomplished, historic, first ballot Hall of Fame coach, but then things have happened, and things have happened off the field, and I'll just sort of leave that up to the audience to make their own conclusions.
Great sports wrap and a take on mic drop. Good job, man.
Blue,
And you
blue.
read and you ran headlong into a lifelong Giants fan too. So I never doubted him. It's just there's a lot going on there, as we both
There it is.
know. Um, Assignment editor, will you just again briefly break that down? Where do you find them? What's their makeup, and what's that thing we may not have thought of that makes them such a key element and then key for you?
One of the things I think one of our, some of our secret sauce here at WRAL is that we have some great assignment editors, and we have 4 assignment editors who have a combined 55 years of experience, which is unheard of in our business. And with budget cutbacks and other decisions made by companies not to really value that position, a lot of stations either are having a lot of inexperienced people in those roles, or they've gone without completely. And for us, it's someone who really understands what breaking news is. They're part of the nerve center of the newsroom. They're part of, where everything is coming through them, as far as dispatching of crews, finding out breaking news. They're getting phone calls and tips. And especially once you have somebody established, they develop their own sources because they're on the phones with public information officers and other stakeholders throughout the
Mhm.
day. So it's a different dynamic than a reporter, but they do develop and build their own sources that it really does help when trying to determine is something a story or not, or how much of a story it may or may not be. So it's really finding someone who loves news and has that curiosity, very similar to a reporter, actually.
Last thing on my question on the on-air folks and how you hire and what sets them apart is weather. My favorite weatherman all time is David Letterman, of course. Have you found Lettermans along the way, and where are they today? But seriously, what's different about that role?
One thing I would say, the consistency, I will say, before I get to the differences, is understanding all of the platforms, just because we now live in a world where it's twofold. People still come to us for weather, they come to local news for weather above all else. At the same time, you can Google the weather. You don't, you hypothetically, you do not need to go to TV to get your weather. We promote our own weather app where we have really
Hmm.
specific science and technology where you can do hurricane tracking and storm tracking and future casting in addition to the your current conditions and your 24 hours and your 7-day forecast. There's a lot of added value there. And what I would say the differentiator is, what is the added value that human can bring, that whether they are doing a forecast on Instagram, our mobile app, WRAL.com, or on TV, that sometimes the added value of a human being able to walk me through my day and walk me through and my family exactly what I need to know in the next 24, 48, 72 hours, or when we have major weather events, whether that is a hurricane, a snowstorm, or just inconvenient weather that's going to interrupt my picnic, my soccer practice, the drive to pick up my spouse or my kids from school, or whatever that may be, that someone who can really clearly, explicitly help me and my family every day, that's the real added value, and really a great storyteller at the end of the day, and someone who really, that it's more than just the science, but the science is obviously very important. It's weather, but it's also combining the science with the storytelling to make sure that we're impactful for people in our community.
What role does coaching play uh, from a producer standpoint, an on-air standpoint, and where else in your division do you make that important?
I think coaching is, I think, important in just about every job. And one of the things that I think WRAL does very well is, and doesn't mean we don't have room to grow, because we do, but we really try to do a lot of one-on-one sessions between managers, and whether that's producers, reporters, assignment editors, photographers. Like our news operations manager, who I mentioned earlier, does one-on-ones and then group meetings with the photographers to really, we talk about the lighting, the editing, that it's not just the written word, but it's the marriage of the visuals with that written word, that everything works together. And that that if you're just watching one story online, or you're watching a newscast or a collection of stories, that everything flows together, that you also have a beginning, middle, and end, and really teaching all those folks that. And I would even just say, from a management perspective, of how I try to coach my fellow managers, of these are the objectives, this is why we're doing this. And I think really, in this day and age especially, and I would say this is far broader than media or journalism or news or content, but I think in any industry, making sure your employees know why you're doing something and how you're going to get it done, and understanding the why, I think, is critically important. And the one thing that I always have to remind myself, I may say why, but it's the um, making sure I repeat it over and over again, that you can't presume everybody's listening at all times, and you got to give grace for that. But at the same time, making sure that your message is relentlessly consistent, and that makes your product relentlessly consistent. And if you're able to do that, more people are going to find it, because they know exactly what they're getting every time they go to WRAL News, whether it's on their phone or tablet or TV.
One of our go-tos, and when I've worked with producers and on-air folk, of course, is you're thinking about who's seeing what you're doing, right? And one way to kind of shed the nerves and just concentrate on the story is to think about one person, perhaps. Who in your market, who have you learned to be the target? And do you like reporters thinking that way, as opposed to, oh, I'm on air with the whole town or the whole region? Is it playing a part lately, this analysis of audience? And what do you get them thinking in terms of, I'm speaking to whom?
So I use a phrase often, not even just in this newsroom, but in previous ones. I've just picked a name, and I call her Sue. Who is Sue, who's 45 years old, who's raising a couple kids, who may or may not have a college education, may or may not be married, but is definitely living paycheck to paycheck? What does she care about? And if you're thinking in that perspective of, someone who's living paycheck to paycheck, how can we help them get through their day, make their lives a little easier? How do we help them save money? How do we help them feel safe in their home? How do we make them understand what's going on in their children's education system. And that really gets down to what are content cornerstones, and people care about things the most that really tug on emotion. And you think of their family, their money, and their security. And I really just, probably the room is so sick and tired of me talking about Sue, who's 45 with two kids and living paycheck to paycheck. But it really does, like, you have to, you know, get into that mode. For me, I actually think of one of my sisters because they're moms and they have girls, and they're in school, and they're, just, living their life day to day, week to week. Everybody needs to have someone like that in their life, whether it's family, friends, and that's why I just bring up, if you don't have that, here's Sue, who's 45, raising a couple kids, living paycheck to paycheck. How do we help her? How do we,
Hmm.
as a member of the community, help her? And that's really, like, if we have to oversimplify this to really make people understand of who we're going for. And I would just say that that's what we're going for at the end of the day.
And because of that, the consumer piece and the investigative piece have become more and more important over time. Not fresh and new like it just came up. I mean,
Right.
Action News, WPVI in Philadelphia, which has been number one by a mile forever, has had an investigative reporter, I think, since late 70s.
Yeah.
But that is increasingly important, isn't it? As a separator in your own marketplace, and also because you're speaking to Sue and her pocketbook and in her safety, right?
Yeah, I would say it goes even deeper than that, in the sense of, in your daily content, what is going to be your distinctive point of difference. And you really need to look at, um, what is going to make your product different than what other stations are doing. All of us have talked to folks, whether it's family or friends that are out of our, that have nothing to do with this line of work. And I've heard often over the last couple of decades, well, it doesn't matter what channel I watch or what website I go to because you all do the same thing. And
Right.
more and more so, we have to make sure that we're being very overt and direct to let our audiences know that we're doing something different, and that we're covering the big stories of the day. We're covering the things that you care about the most, but we're going to go deeper into it, and we're going to give you more comprehensive coverage, and we're going to give you stories that you're not going to see in other places. And yes, definitely the investigative reporter and the consumer reporter help with that original content, but that also needs to be played into the daily coverage. And sometimes whenever you have a big story, yes, you got to cover what's happening when when that big breaking story happens. But you also have to look at what you may have considered a few years ago a day two story on day one, that you're always three steps ahead of the audience and everybody in your competitors. That that way you're really just, it forces you to think next level, think deeper, and ask the questions and get the questions answered that if you were at home you would be asking yourself.
I know at times you are chasing the same story as the station down the block.
Yeah.
So then the separators can be the people that bring you the story.
Hmm.
How has recruiting talent changed? And if you don't mind drilling down all the way to, do you still hire or by reels? Or are you finding people online? I don't know, but you tell
Yeah.
me, how has it changed? How do you operate? And how can I better myself to maybe make myself more marketable?
Yeah, what I would say is, we no different, we follow federal laws that we post our jobs and we put a job description, and then we advertise in a number of places, on journalism websites, various groups with journalism or media ties. In addition to that, there are times, when we're looking for a particular role, and it may be a very highly specialized role, where, we may do our own recruiting. And sometimes that can, especially for reporter jobs, photographer jobs, producing jobs, where, I'll go on YouTube and I'll look, well, let me see who's out there and who's around. And not every job or every connection you make from that is necessarily for the next job. One of the things we really try to do is keep a pipeline going and keep relationships going, that there may be someone who we're looking at that maybe there's an opening in a year, or maybe it's in 6 months. Um, and we really try to build those relationships. When I look at, okay, who are the, from a candidate perspective, the things I mentioned as far as great storytelling, great journalism, understanding social platforms. I also want to see growth, just in the sense of
Mm,
that someone's on an upward trajectory. One of the other things that really, from an audience perspective, that we know that the audience is wanting right now is accountability, in the sense of um, holding our government officials accountable, like not just taking the PR two-line response that doesn't even really answer a question and just moving on, that we're actually being an advocate for the viewer and being a voice for the voiceless to get answers. And someone who has a track record of that before they walk into WRAL and embraces that, is someone who's more likely going to be a member of our team one day. And it sounds easy enough, but asking tough questions sometimes is not easy. And we now live in a world where primary modes of communication are text messages. They're not necessarily, knocking on someone's door, trying to get a one-on-one interview. And now, from the other side of the people who are trying to hold accountable, they have made themselves less and less available in order to, or even at news conferences, or just doing a one-on-one interview. So it is challenging, but we really try to use creative storytelling techniques where we will put the questions on the screen that we're trying to get answered on behalf of the viewer, and not
mm,
everybody embraces that, because they worry about that. It's not, it's, in some ways they don't view that, they feel like it's too much, maybe for a better, lack of better terms. But someone who really embraces holding the powerful accountable is somebody who's more likely going to be able to be a really strong player here at WRAL. But I would also say in a lot of other places as well, that you really, we have to be fighting on behalf of the viewer, and being a voice for the voiceless. And people who embrace that, um, or who have embraced that in their reels and in their work from the beginning of their careers, I think are the people who are going to ultimately be more successful, whether that is in this newsroom or in other newsrooms. Just because that, in part, is a distinctive point of difference where not everybody's doing it, or to the degree that I think is necessary in order for us to continue to be impactful and relevant in people's lives.
stellar stuff. Mike Friedrich, a true pro. And thank you for taking the time to do Mic Drop today.
Absolutely.
Your insights are so valuable. You've been there, done that. You wanted to be Dick Enberg at one point, and now you're leading.
Oh my. In the words of Dick Enberg, oh my.
Well played, really well played. I can't tell you how, if you're out there and you want to get into the news business, to not only follow your path, but to listen to your words and insights, very valuable. I appreciate you very, very much.
Thank you for the pleasure of having the opportunity to talk with you today.